Hey everyone, hope you're all having a great day. So you've probably already heard of the recent Questron and Awkward drama, and unsurprisingly, many people on both sides of the discussion have come forward to present their own takes and opinions. While I won't suppose that my opinion is any more valuable than anybody else's, I wanted to attempt to take the drama out of the drama and as thoughtfully as I can, analyze the ideas being presented, and hopefully encourage better conversations regardless of one's own prior convictions and beliefs. Before I start, I of course want to emphasize that I will not be attacking either person as individuals, nor would I encourage, and in fact I would discourage anyone else from doing so as well. What I would encourage is that regardless of which side of the conversation you find yourself on, be willing to hear ideas that potentially challenge your own. With that being said, I think there are several interesting ideas being presented, and I wanted to take the time to address each one individually. You might have noticed that this video is quite long, and so if you're only interested in specific topics, I've made timestamps for each topic in the description. And these are the topics that I'm going to be talking about in this video. To start, I wanted to address Questron's initial tweets, since that's where this conversation originated from. In summary, I think the general message we should interpret from Questron is that he's made sacrifices in certain areas of his life in an effort to pursue his dream, and some of those sacrifices are probably more challenging than what one might expect. There are some more specific claims being made, with the main controversial point being that streaming is difficult, and some secondary points like streaming not being something you can clock out from. But the first thing we should address is the contention that all of Questron's aforementioned hardships are his own quote-unquote fault. What is the nature of personal accountability, decisions, and consequences? In particular, is it ever reasonable to suggest that the consequences of one's own decisions can be difficult in some way? Many people have been quick to point out that all of Questron's proposed challenges are results of things he has chosen, implying of course that Questron doesn't have the logical right to complain about those things, since if he wanted to, he could simply give up on his dream and consequently solve all of those problems. Maybe it is possible for Questron to solve those challenges without giving up on his dream, but before we talk about functional solutions, we should think about the nature of hardship in relation to our own decisions. Certainly, many major life decisions are inevitably going to come with various sacrifices, especially career decisions. If an office worker tells me that they've had a rather long day, month, or year, would the first reasonable response really be to suggest that they don't have a right to say that since they chose to work in their field? They probably did, but even then that's likely an overdramatic response, as surely it shouldn't be difficult to comprehend that even if certain consequences are causally linked to our own decisions, the mere recognition that those decisions can pose challenges that one might struggle with shouldn't be particularly controversial. I'm sure we've all had long days in pursuit of our goals, probably financial goals, and taken a moment to recognize that working can sometimes be difficult, even if the goals are our own. After all, we all have to choose some career path with its own challenges, and if making any amount of decision means that all subsequent challenges are invalid to even point out, then that would mean that no career path can truly be self-labeled as challenging, unless you're literally a slave against your will.
There are people out there who really struggle. There are people out there who quite literally die. There are starving children who cannot afford food because they don't get paid enough for the work that they do. There are single mothers out there working 2 shifts, 14 hours a day just to feed their children. And you tell me that you sitting, clicking start stream and making some goofy animations nobody cares about is harder than that job. That's so ridiculous. That is so disrespectful to people who actually struggle.
Obviously, Awkward holds quite a strong opinion about the matter and truly believes that perhaps Questron is blatantly disrespecting certain groups of people who face challenges greater than his own. Logically speaking though, if the only consequences that can be labeled as difficult are the ones that have nothing to do with our own decisions, then we have to ask, is there anything at all in life that can be labeled as truly difficult? Even for the aforementioned groups of people who certainly would face extraordinary difficulty in life, such as those who struggle to feed their own children, using the exact same logic, would they have the right to suggest that their life is challenging? For every parent who struggles to raise 1 child, there's another that struggles to raise 2, and there's yet another who struggles to raise 3. If the existence of those with greater hardships necessarily implies the inability to talk about one's own challenges, then logically there is only one person on Earth at any given time who has the right to speak about their own struggles. After all, we could just as easily say that parents who struggle to feed their children only struggle because they chose to have children in the first place. And yet most people can probably agree that saying something like this to a parent would be quite offensive. At a fundamental level, is there anything in life that can truly be labeled as something you have to do, and not something you decided for yourself? Perhaps the true criticism of Questron is maybe his wording. He makes his challenges sound overly circumstantial rather than personal, which subsequently comes off as whiny, which is what I believe triggered the negative response. If an office worker tells me that the world forced him to work long hours, then that's probably worth at least some rebuttal, since there are probably certain reasonable decisions they could have made to have prevented that from happening. and so one might criticize them for not seeing the importance of their own decisions. I think Questron's mistake in this sense is that he doesn't really make it clear whether he believes his challenges are personal or circumstantial, and so the interpretation is left to the reader, and how you're going to interpret the message is inevitably going to be shaped by your own personality. For me, I would give Questron the benefit of the doubt and interpret his tweet as just someone who's venting a bit about various struggles they're currently engaging with in pursuit of their dreams that the average person might not be aware of. And I don't think that's necessarily something bad to do, maybe not something that's advisable to do on Twitter, but in general, not something that I would label as an example of an extreme character flaw worthy of ridicule. But at the same time, since that interpretation isn't necessarily clear, I can see why some people will see the tweets as an example of someone who is blaming everything but themselves, presenting themselves unrightfully as a victim and indirectly insulting those who truly have to live in challenging conditions, which would in fact be a character trait that is worthy of being criticized. I wonder if Questron hadn't included words like because of streaming, or one day I might be lucky, maybe Awkward and other people with similar opinions wouldn't have viewed Questron's tweet in the same way. We can all probably agree that regardless of which side you're on, that life can sometimes be difficult, and simultaneously believe in the value of self-accountability. Perhaps before we assume the worst in someone, we should take a moment to clarify whether the person we seemingly disagree with actually holds the ideas that we think they do. The second point we should address is the matter of whether streaming can be considered difficult, and what does it actually mean. Questron himself presents quite a large list of reasons for why he believes that streaming presents difficulties in his life. In summary, Questron claims that streaming negatively affects his social life, induces anxiety and stress, requires a large time commitment, and negatively affects his physical health. The two main responses are that 1, Questron chooses to be a streamer, and 2, that streaming is merely the act of doing exactly what one has always done, namely playing games, with the only difference being that you now stream it. With point 1, again, I don't think it's fair to say that something can't be difficult, simply because we voluntarily choose those challenges, nor would I think it disqualifies us from at least acknowledging those challenges to our peers. In addition, it's not really a response that is connected to the primary topic of discussion in this case. For example, if someone suggested to me that playing golf is difficult, and I responded with, well, you don't have to play golf, that would actually be quite off topic, as the person I'm responding to has in no way referred to golf as a necessity. The second point, made primarily but not exclusively by Awkward, is that streaming is as easy as simply pressing the Start Stream button on OBS.
So when you say that streaming is a harder job than a 9 to 5 or just a regular job, you're being an ungrateful you understand? Streaming is relatively an easy job, and I'm not gonna sit here and pretend like what I do is not, I'm not gonna use the word privilege, but I am very, very fortunate to do what I do. I sit here in front of a PC talking, playing video games, uploading videos to YouTube that require borderline almost no effort, and I make a lot of money out of it.
I think the primary issue that Awkward has in this case is potentially that Questron has stated implicitly that working a 9 to 5 is less difficult, or at the very least equally as difficult as being a professional streamer, while also potentially suggesting that there isn't any way for him to improve his circumstances. Although I don't think Awkward has said anything factually incorrect, I think his response is based on what I would identify as a particularly uncharitable interpretation of Questron's words. Uncharitable in the philosophical sense, meaning that Awkward isn't really interpreting Questron's words in a rational way. If a person who is currently running a profitable business tells me that running a business is more difficult than working a 9 to 5, I would think that the most logical interpretation of what they're specifically referring to is that accumulating the capital to start a business and subsequently figuring out the decisions that facilitate the growth of the business in such a way that it eventually yields results comparable to that of your average 9 to 5 job is not easy. I would probably not interpret their words as meaning that literally selling a product is difficult, or that owning an already established, successful, and self-sustaining business is harder than a 9 to 5. In the same way, I wouldn't look at Questron's tweet and assume that what he's saying is that pressing Start Stream and broadcasting video data over the internet is difficult, or that he's saying that a life would be more difficult as a streamer that can make 6 figures sitting in front of a camera. Rather, the most logical interpretation of Questron's words is that simply becoming, not being, but becoming a streamer with an income comparable to a 9 to 5 is difficult. And so streaming might be difficult in the sense that it's simply a tricky thing to make financially viable. It wouldn't make sense to counter this by suggesting that Questron doesn't have to be a streamer, because that's not the point. All Questron is really saying is that becoming a successful streamer is difficult, and certainly, it would be difficult to imagine an argument suggesting that it's somehow easy. In addition, I think we also should consider the fact that a career is not as simple as waking up and making a decision. While yes, we do make choices, it's certainly an oversimplification to pretend that people can't be stuck in difficult positions career-wise. For example, let's say that someone invests in a career that was a great idea given available information, but due to unpredictable changes in the market, becomes gradually unviable. It's perfectly conceivable that one could be stuck in a situation where their current career doesn't support them in the future, but available alternatives don't support them in the present. While sure, there are probably some self-accountable things they could do to improve their career strategy, I don't think them daring to suggest that they're in a bit of a tough spot to be outside the realm of reason. I do understand that it's quite easy to see Questron as someone who's merely quote-unquote crying about how life is difficult and how the world has forced him to be a streamer against his will, but I really don't think that's a fair interpretation. To be fair to Awkward as well, although I think Awkward has perhaps misunderstood Questron's intentions, Awkward probably genuinely believes that Questron is presenting himself as a victim, unrightfully claiming circumstantial hardship for things he has caused himself, and if he genuinely believes that, I can at least sympathize with why he might react so strongly.
And these people have never worked a day in their life. They just sit in front of their computer all day doing absolutely nothing, providing garbage value, destroying their own life, and by extension destroying their viewers' life because they don't teach anything of value, and blatantly disrespecting people that are actually trying very hard to even just keep themselves afloat, to pay rent, to get food, to feed their children. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. And I'm not sitting here pretending as if I do, like, oh, it's so hard. Yes, it's not easy to do what I do, but I'm not gonna sit here and pretend like I would swap with somebody starving to death.
Here, Awkward is probably referring to successful streamers specifically. I'm not sure if Awkward intended this specific statement to be directed towards Questron specifically, but if he did, it would be quite strange considering the fact that Awkward doesn't seem to think of Questron as a successful, nor has Questron claimed to be one, and additionally, Questron himself would probably not disagree with the idea that successful streamers have it easy. The next thing we should address is the notion of laziness and what it actually means to be lazy. The accusation of laziness is one of Awkward's primary criticisms, and perhaps the one thing that Questron took the most offense to. We'll set aside the problems of delivery for now and focus on whether the accusation itself is well-founded. The conventional use of the word lazy when used to describe a person simply refers to the quality of being unwilling to do work. And so in order to say that Questron is lazy, we would have to provide evidence that Questron is unwilling to do work, which, given the fact that Questron has already dedicated so much of his efforts into his passion for streaming, it would certainly be a difficult argument to make. The key word here is willingness, which inherently implies intentionality. So to make the argument that Questron is lazy, one would have to prove that Questron has been engaging in activities that he himself sincerely believes to be unproductive. And I don't think the evidence shows that at all. Even if we assume that we can criticize Questron's prioritizing abilities as being unproductive, laziness in its conventional usage has nothing to do with whether or not the work leads to success. Only that one has to be willing to do things and that one believes that the things they do are productive. Sure, a person can be mistaken, but being mistaken doesn't mean that you're lazy. At this point, I'm not necessarily defending Questron directly, but I mostly take issue with the improper use of language. If anything, given Awkward's subsequent elaboration that Questron has been consistently unsuccessful, the correct derogatory term would have been dumb or stupid, not lazy. In Awkward's response, he proposes his own variation of the word lazy, referring to quote-unquote laziness of the mind.
But there's also lazy of the mind. You've been sitting creating these animations for 4 years. 4 years. That's your comfort zone. Ironically enough, it is lazy to do the same thing over and over and not stepping outside of your comfort zone. It is lazy. It is lazy. And what kind of a stupid argument that is? I want to see you make it. Just because I can make cookies, it's not particularly hard for me to make cookies, but it also could be hard for other people to make cookies. I want to see you bake cookies. It's a stupid argument. It's such a ridiculous argument. Makes no sense whatsoever. For me, baking cookies is easy. Therefore, baking cookies is lazy.
Allegedly, it is lazy to do easy things repeatedly. While I can see what Awkward might be trying to get at, it leads to some interesting logic. In general, the things that we do get easier over time due to practice, and practice in general requires repetition. Which, at least using a surface-level interpretation of this logic, that would mean that the better you get at something, the lazier you are, I guess. Maybe what Awkward means is that if what you're doing is obviously not working and you don't change that, you're lazy, but that's certainly not a conventional use of the word. Again, a more accurate derogatory term in this case probably would have been stupid, or at the very least stubborn, rather than lazy, if this is what we meant to say. It seems to be the case that if Questron was good at streaming, he would be lazy, since he's doing what is easy. Yet at the same time, apparently, if Questron is bad at streaming, he's also lazy. Maybe Awkward means to say that if you don't aim to improve, or if you insist on doing things that don't show obvious improvement, maybe then you are lazy.
Stepping outside of the comfort zone to create something better to improve your own life is not lazy.
But at least in my evaluation of the evidence, there doesn't seem to be any indication that Questron is not sincerely trying his best to improve his circumstances. So again, the insistence on the word lazy just seems misplaced. If anything, just looking at his stats, Questron's following trends upwards as he continues to develop as a streamer, and so even the accusation that Questron isn't showing gradual improvement is not really well founded. Sure, we can always say that maybe Questron hasn't made the most optimal decisions possible with respect to being a streamer, and perhaps he could use some help in that regard. But let's imagine that we lived in a universe where Questron was the biggest Overwatch streamer of all time, renowned for his excellent animation skills. Would he have been able to dodge the accusations of laziness in that case? I would speculate that if that were the case and Questron made the exact same tweets, Awkward would have still said the exact same thing. Would a successful Questron indicate less laziness because he improved more, or would it indicate more laziness because his life was easier? It seems to be the case that for Awkward, laziness isn't really derivative of willingness, intention, effort, productivity, or success, but rather it seems that regardless of any of those things, so long as one dares to complain about their circumstances, they are automatically lazy. It certainly goes without saying that Awkward has a certain contempt for any suggestion that one is a victim of circumstance, even if it is true, essentially believing that there is no utility in fixating on what one cannot control, and therefore any attempt at doing so is an attempt to absolve oneself of personal responsibility. Of course, the principle of self-accountability is a respectable virtue, but surely being self-accountable need not imply that one has a fantastical view of oneself to the point that they believe nothing in life is circumstantial. As with many things in life, the extreme approach is rarely tenable. The best way to maximize your chance of success should surely be to simultaneously recognize your own limitations and challenges while also recognizing your abilities and potential. I'm going to speculate a bit, but perhaps the one word that struck a nerve was Questron's suggestion that, quote, "one day I might get lucky," where the offending word is the word lucky, potentially suggesting that hardship and success were down to luck or random chance. An idea that would certainly directly oppose Awkward's primary outlook on life. As I've said before, I think that's a rather uncharitable reading of Questron's tweets, but if Awkward sincerely believes that that is what Questron is saying, I can at the very least see why he might react so strongly. This leads into a larger topic that I wanted to address, which is the nature of communication, delivery, and language. One of the most common criticisms of Awkward's response has to do with his delivery, citing that even if what he said could be true, and even if his intentions were benevolent, the delivery of his message was disrespectful. One of the most common responses to this is that even if Awkward is being disrespectful, mean, or rude, why does it matter if what he's saying is true?
Talking about him personally is disrespectful. It doesn't matter what it is. It's how is that not true though?
I'll talk about whether respect is important in the next point I'll address, but for now, we should at least establish the matters of fact and answer the question, is Awkward actually being disrespectful? There seems to be this idea that has become quite popular that if what you're saying is true, nothing you say can be disrespectful, or that somehow the only thing that should ever be taken into consideration in language is the truth value of words. This belief results in the so-called "I'm just being honest" defense, a response that is commonly invoked against any criticisms of character, as if somehow the only virtue that exists in life is truth, and that somehow there are no other valid character flaws beyond that. To be fair, this isn't even a direct criticism of Awkward, as anyone, and many people often are, victims of this belief. It's just that we only tend to use this attitude against people we don't like, who happen to be criticizing our character. In addition, appealing to your honesty or truthfulness is not really even a valid response to the primary criticism in the first place. If someone accuses your delivery of being disrespectful, that's not an attack on your logic or truthfulness, and so responding with, "I'm just being honest," is a bit of a red herring fallacy, an attempt to distract from opposing arguments rather than addressing them directly. Hopefully, it should be obvious to all of us that there are of course elements of communication that go beyond the simple truth value of words. Things like body language, facial expression, tone of voice, and choice of wording are all important, where the last elements is especially important in written language, since we lack the ability to utilize the other three when we're not speaking. Connotation, which is the feeling of words, is just as important as denotation, the literal meaning of words. Choosing your words with consideration for both is advisable if we want to communicate our thoughts and ideas accurately. Furthermore, the context of communication is also an important element if we want to be taken seriously. How you speak should absolutely change depending on things like who you're speaking to, where you are speaking, and when you are speaking. We all take these elements of communication into account in our everyday lives, and denying this convention of language and culture, or suggesting that it's somehow impossible to be respectfully honest, is, as the kids say these days, copium, a simple denial of reality clinging to an obviously false belief of how human communication works. Even for those with neurological challenges that make it difficult to understand social etiquette, for whom we should be sympathetic, it's fairly easy to realize that the way you speak to your friends is not the same way you speak to your boss, is not the same way you speak to your parents, and is not the same way you speak to a stranger. If someone wants to meet me at 1 o'clock and they tell me to rendezvous at 1300, I'm rightfully going to ask them why their choice of wording is so weird, even if what they're saying is factually correct and I'm capable of understanding it perfectly. because their choice of wording is simply objectively weird, according to the modern standards of the English language. So after this bit of preamble, let's ask the question, is awkward objectively being disrespectful under the modern standards of the English language? And I would say the most reasonable claim is yes. Intuitively, making uncalled for, blunt, and derogatory statements are always going to be seen as at least somewhat rude, and usually exceedingly rude in most conceivable contexts, including on the internet. Additionally, emphasizing your own achievements while being derogatory is just adding insult to injury, is largely unnecessary if you're truly attempting to give advice, and automatically makes your intentions questionable. Awkward himself recognizes the distinction between rudeness and politeness and admits in his own words that he was harsher than he had to be. This begs the question, why be unnecessarily harsh if there's a viable alternative?
For example, let's say I'll take Inconsiderate Raccoon. I see him in the chat. Inconsiderate Raccoon, and nice for me to say, I don't like your shirt. But if I say your shirt is ugly, could be a little bit more mean, but it's still the same sentence, just phrased differently.
Make no mistake, it's absolutely possible to give advice and criticize someone that didn't ask for it in a respectful way. And in general, saying things directly and bluntly is not the way to do it. That doesn't mean you have to lie or sugarcoat your words to make someone feel good. The utility of respect and decency is not necessarily for good feelings, it simply informs others that you're not someone who wishes to do harm. Many are quick to say that telling the truth is better than lying for the sake of someone's feelings, but pretending that the only two possible modes of communication are brutal honesty and compassionate dishonesty is frankly being quite intentionally obtuse. Don't get me wrong, Awkward certainly has the freedom and of course the right to say things however he wants, and he doesn't owe anyone anything, but that's not the point. The point is that the defense of Awkward not being disrespectful by suggesting that he's quote-unquote just being honest is not only off topic, but just objectively wrong. You can certainly be honest while also being disrespectful. The two things are not mutually exclusive. To prove my point, I'll attempt to show that it's perfectly possible to reword Awkward's tweet in a more respectful way while simultaneously retaining the ideas being expressed. It sounds like you're facing quite a few challenges, and although I understand that streaming can in some ways be difficult, I sincerely think that there are some areas you could significantly improve on. I've also had the experience of being a streamer while also ensuring that I don't compromise my health in other areas of my life, and I've even learned to improve at that over time. I fundamentally believe that being a successful streamer can be simple, since as gamers, a lot of our time we now spend streaming would have been spent gaming anyway. While I can see that you've put a lot of effort into creating animations, I think your time and efforts could be better spent elsewhere. To be honest, I don't think you've been willing to try different things to maximize your success, and even simple things like going to the gym or getting frequent haircuts are important parts of a good work ethic that respectfully, I don't think you've been taking as seriously as you should. If you want to have a conversation about this, I would love to share more of my thoughts, and I would even be willing to meet with you in person. Given Awkward's 40+ minute video clarifying his stance, I believe that this rewording of his tweet is not only a far more accurate representation of his ideas and supposed intention, but it's also just much more respectful, while simultaneously communicating the exact same concepts.
If he actually does this, I will host him. I will quite literally travel. If he does this, I will travel to the Netherlands where he lives, and I'm going to go to the gym together with him. Honest to God, take my word for it.
Admittedly, being respectful is generally more verbose than being rude, but surely typing a few more words to communicate our ideas better shouldn't be too much to ask lest we risk being lazy. Compassionate dishonesty is in many ways more harmful than brutal honesty, but let's not kid ourselves by pretending that compassionate honesty is some kind of mythical creature. If you claim to be well-intentioned, it would of course be wise to communicate that specifically along with the so-called truth in the formulation of your ideas. When respect and decency are easy, the lack of it automatically becomes questionable. The truth hurts is a commonly repeated slogan, and so if you know that and the only thing you say is the quote-unquote truth with no obvious intention communicated, people will rightfully assume that your only intention was to be hurtful, hiding behind the facade of trying to be helpful. Why not choose to communicate respectfully if one can? Especially if one is trying to apparently improve the well-being of others and not actually trying to be hurtful. Convincing someone of new ideas is of course far easier when they're willing to listen to what you have to say. If someone isn't willing to listen despite communicating respectfully, then at the very least you know that you've done all that you could, and the person you're trying to help is without excuse. But without respect, it's really not that weird if people don't want to listen to you. Let's not pretend that the only possible reason that people don't want to listen to us is because they quote-unquote can't handle the truth. There are plenty of reasons to not want to listen to someone, and one of them is definitely because you think the person that you're talking to has malicious intentions. Now, Awkward has essentially asserted in his 40+ minute response video that he does not in fact have malicious intentions, and he just wants to do what's best for Questron. But if that's the case, then his tweet is certainly one massive miscommunication, at least with respect to expressing that idea. Certainly, I think it's fair to say that if our written sentences require 40 minutes of additional monologue in order to clarify our stance, maybe our writing needs some work. If we take Awkward and Questron out of the equation and read Awkward's tweet as if it was written by someone we didn't know, can we really, with honesty, say that this arbitrary person is speaking with the best intentions? At the minimum, there is certainly nothing in the tweet that indicates that this person was trying to be helpful. If instead what Awkward had done was that he showed his editor his response video, asked his editor to summarize his thoughts, and his editor came up with what Awkward wrote in his tweet, it would be quite shocking if Awkward considered that to be an accurate representation of his ideas. I sincerely believe that Awkward has good intentions, but if we speak with disrespectful language, we shouldn't be surprised if people assume we're disrespectful people. Just like if someone spoke with a Parisian French accent, it would be pretty reasonable to simply assume that they're French, even if there's a chance they might not be, just based on statistical likelihood. It would of course be silly to assume by default that people who disrespect you somehow have your best interests in mind. If we don't want to be confused for someone who is disrespectful, we shouldn't speak disrespectfully. In the same way, if you don't want people to think you're French, just don't speak with a French accent. Claiming that people ought to only pay attention to the content of language is a principle of debate, but it's not a realistic approach to communication in general. The reality is that no matter how logical one wants to be, ignoring the emotional aspects of communication or demanding that other people ignore it is itself ironically illogical, if you know you're communicating with a human. There seems to be this idea that it's not how I say something, but what I say that matters. But ultimately, both of these things matter equally, as how you say something directly affects what you're trying to say. The words, "I think you're overweight" and "you're a fat ass" do not mean the same thing. Sure, they do express the same literal idea, and can both be evidently true, but we'd be wise to at the very least recognize this distinction. Many claim that the world is simply too sensitive, and though that may be true, it's fairly ridiculous to claim that other people are overly sensitive if you willingly choose to use insensitive language. At the very least, you would need to be using neutral language in order to make that claim. You can't claim to be a friendly person while simultaneously insulting everyone around you. Sure, offensive language can in some contexts even be quite humorous, but directing it towards someone who you're not well acquainted with is not advisable. It might be the case that people are offended by the truth, but the truth is that people are reasonably going to be offended by offensive language, as they should be. If the use of offensive language wasn't considered offensive, then it wouldn't be called offensive language in the first place. It would just be called normal language. Sure, if you feel insulted, it'd be wise not to react too strongly, but you would be a fool not to recognize that the person insulting you is probably not trying to be your friend. It's often impossible to speak unfiltered when you know you're among friends, but many often make the mistake of believing that that's how you make friends in the first place. There seems to be this weird idea that we wish we could just speak however we wanted all the time without social consequence. But if you speak French among native English speakers, don't be surprised if the consequence is that no one understands what you're talking about. Perhaps one might believe that we should all be speaking French and not English if French is your preferred language, but if you want your message to reach people accurately, it would be wise to meet people where they are rather than demanding that they meet you where you are. Again, people are free legally and physically speaking to say whatever they want, in whatever way they please, but then we shouldn't act like victims when people don't understand what we're saying. To put it more simply, if you speak without compassion, don't be surprised if people see that as a reflection of an uncompassionate character. Moving on to the concluding point that I want to make, I'm going to be taking a step back from Awkward and Questron and talk about something that I consider to be a much larger topic, which is the value of compassion itself with respect to the goal of improving the lives and well-being of other people. It's often tempting to accuse those that we disagree with for being uncompassionate, but rarely do we ever reflect on ourselves and realize that we are often guilty of the exact same things. Ironically, we often accuse others of being uncompassionate, and our first response is to do the same in return. If compassion is reserved only for those we like, then I would argue that it would be meaningless. Many of even the worst people who have ever existed probably had friends that they were kind to. True compassion is non-selective, and thus, the true test of compassion comes precisely when it is difficult. I hope in my previous points I've made a sufficient argument for the existence of language that is simultaneously compassionate and honest. But there is still the question of the value and utility of compassion itself. What if what one believes is not that brutal honesty is necessary, but that brutality is preferable? Being compassionate certainly doesn't solve every problem in the world, but I find that compassion is often quickly ignored in favor of being as brutal as possible, which is a common reaction when we feel that something we value personally is being attacked. I think we often make the mistake of believing that compassion is a sign of weakness. confusing it for things like undeserved praise and unjustified tolerance, but I think this is a misunderstanding. Being compassionate doesn't mean that we lie to people to make them feel good or that we have to accept the action of bullies. And I would argue that by definition, neither of those things would be very compassionate at all, as real compassion is the quality of having a concern for the well-being of others, and dishonesty and accepting abuse is certainly not consistent with improving the lives of others. Obviously, nobody is going to consider themselves uncompassionate, as for the most part, everybody tries their best to do what they believe is right, at least in the ways that they know how. I think this very realization is incredibly important. The people we disagree with aren't sitting in dark rooms thinking of ways to make the world worse. They're just people trying their best who could sometimes be making a mistake. Confronting those with whom we disagree with brutality, whether honest or not, is not only incompatible with true compassion, it's not actually likely to improve the lives of very many people. Because of course, if we position ourselves as enemies, we're not going to be making many friends. This means that the person with whom you believed was living in error doesn't benefit from the ideas you believe to be better. In order to be compassionate, we can't just tell people to change and then walk away. We need to make a real effort to understand the person we're talking to and thoughtfully speak in a way that we believe they will understand. This doesn't mean that we will always be successful in convincing others to change, but at the very least, making an effort seems quite reasonable. It's contradictory to say on the one hand that we want to improve the well-being of others, and on the other hand claim that we don't care if people don't want to listen to what we have to say, unless we for some reason don't believe that what we have to say is meaningful. Making an intellectual effort to convince other people of ideas that we believe to be better isn't always necessary, but is necessary if we truly want to say that we want the world to be a better place. Appealing to the fact that our ideas are quote-unquote obvious and therefore that everyone who doesn't immediately believe us when we confront them with the quote-unquote truth is intellectually lazy. In addition, we have to be careful to consider that we could also be the ones making a mistake as well. Even with good intentions, we could inadvertently cause harm in ways that we don't expect. We can only experience and understand the world through things we have already experienced, either by physically experiencing it ourselves or by being taught by people who have experienced it themselves. What this means is that faulting someone for not recognizing something we deem obvious is not only not very kind, it doesn't make much logical sense. Because of course, someone who has never seen a banana before won't know what it looks like, and their inability to recognize said banana isn't a refusal to see the truth, it's just that they genuinely don't have enough information to make the same conclusions that we do. We all have idealized versions of what well-being is supposed to look like based solely on our experiences, but it'd be wise to recognize that everyone experiences the world differently, and what makes us feel good isn't going to be the same for everyone. Compassion is not a strategy, it's a goal, and it's not relative to ourselves, but is relative to the people we interact with. We often have it backwards, believing that the less someone agrees with us, the more brutal we have to be, because they're just so beyond our help. But in reality, the more someone disagrees with us, the more compassionate we should be. Because again, if we truly believe in our own beliefs, it is the people who are furthest from them that need our help the most. You might be tempted with the idea that I'm only criticizing certain people, but I hope I've made it clear that the rarity of compassion is not a trait exclusive to those who disagree with you. Brutality in many ways satisfies the primitive urge to defeat our opposition, and if you're honest, even you are not immune to this instinct. As such, the justification of our own brutality often comes from the fact that our opposition does the same to us, and so the cycle of brutality continues until someone dares to step outside the circle. As a result, compassion is often viewed as a sort of tough sacrifice that one makes, but I would argue that compassion isn't just some virtuous endeavor, it's a pragmatic one as well, and the logical conclusion that is difficult to realize. And I would argue in the never-ending war of ideas that compassion is an objectively better tool than brutality. In a world where compassion is rare, you have the opportunity to set yourself apart and capture the attention of even those who don't agree with you. With brutality, you might gain the temporary satisfaction of fighting your enemies and the reward of feeling that you've won a sense of victory. But with compassion, you have the opportunity to make friends with your enemies, which means that not only do you have one less enemy, you also have one more friend, and you get the real reward of getting to live in a world that is just a little friendlier than it was before. And that's all I have to say for now. If you made it this far in the video, I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.